I found my son-in-law in my daughter's kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and he wasn't alone. My wife was with him. And they weren't talking about groceries. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute. Maybe it was 3 seconds. I don't know. I remember the refrigerator was humming. I remember the overhead light was too bright. I remember thinking, in that strange, hollow way your brain works when it refuses to process what your eyes are showing it, that someone had left the back door unlocked again. Then my wife saw me. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stepped back and pulled her cardigan closed like she was cold. That detail has stayed with me. The cardigan. It was the one my daughter had given her for her birthday 2 years ago. I turned around and walked back to my truck. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 45 minutes. Then I went inside, made myself a cup of tea, and waited for morning. My name is Edward. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working for the city of Edmonton, managing infrastructure contracts. I have a daughter named Claire. I have a wife, or I had one, named Susan. I have or had a son-in-law named Marcus. Claire is 31. She's an accountant. She works for a mid-sized firm downtown, and she is the most organized person I have ever met in my life. She keeps a spreadsheet for her grocery budget. She color-codes her calendar. She is, in every way that matters, the opposite of the chaos that was about to enter our lives. Marcus had been in the picture for 4 years. He sold commercial real estate, drove a black Audi, and had the kind of handshake that lasted a half-second too long. I didn't dislike him. I want to be honest about that. I found him slightly exhausting, the way a very loud television in another room is exhausting, but I didn't dislike him. Claire seemed happy. He seemed to make her laugh. That was enough for me. They got engaged the previous October. Claire called me from the restaurant, still at the table, her voice shaking a little. I could hear Marcus in the background saying something charming to the waiter. I told her I was happy for her. I meant it. The wedding was set for the following June, 8 months away. The morning after I found them, I called Claire. She answered on the second ring. She sounded awake, which struck me as odd. It was barely 7. "Dad," she said. Not a question, just my name. "I need to come over," I said. There was a pause. "I know," she said. I drove the 40 minutes out to her place in Sherwood Park, mostly on autopilot. The whole way, I kept thinking about what I was going to say. I had no idea. I had spent the night building speeches in my head, and every single one of them fell apart before it reached the end. When she opened the door, her eyes were red. She'd been crying, but not recently. The kind of red that comes from the night before, not the morning. She let me in. She'd already made coffee. We sat down at her kitchen table, the same kitchen where, apparently, my wife and her fiancé had decided to blow our entire family to pieces, and she wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me. "How long have you known?" I asked. She stared at the table for a moment. Then she said, 6 weeks. I want to tell you I handled that well. I didn't. I put my elbows on the table and pressed my hands over my face and sat there like that for a long time. My daughter didn't say anything. She just waited. That's one of her qualities. She knows how to wait. Finally, I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked up. Her eyes were steady. "Because I needed time to think," she said, "and because I needed you to not do anything rash before I was ready." I looked at her. "Ready for what?" I said. That's when she told me. She'd found out 6 weeks earlier because she'd come home early from a conference in Calgary. A flight cancellation. then a rebooking, a long delay at the airport, and she'd walked into her own house at 9 on a Thursday night, expecting an empty place. Instead, she'd found Susan's car in the driveway. She hadn't gone inside. She'd sat in her own driveway for 20 minutes and thought about what that meant. Then she'd driven to a hotel. She told me she hadn't cried. She said that surprised her, even now. She'd sat on the hotel bed with her coat still on and thought through everything very carefully, the way she thinks through everything, and she'd arrived at a conclusion. She was not going to blow this up. Not yet. What she was going to do was document. Over the following 6 weeks, while she was still living with Marcus, still showing up to their shared life, still going to wedding venue consultations and talking about centerpieces, she had quietly and methodically gathered every piece of information she needed. She'd hired a private investigator, not someone dramatic, she said. Just a retired RCMP officer who now ran a small firm in St. Albert. She showed me the file on her laptop. Dates, times, locations, photographs. Marcus and Susan at a condo near West Edmonton Mall that Marcus rented under his business's name. 6 confirmed meetings, possibly more. She'd also contacted a family lawyer. Because here's the part I hadn't thought about, because I was still in shock and she had 6 weeks on me. Marcus and Claire had bought their house together. The down payment had come partially from my wife and me, $40,000, given as a gift when they purchased the place. In Susan's name, technically, because that's how we'd always handled larger financial gifts, for tax reasons our accountant had recommended years ago. If the marriage fell apart cleanly, that money was simply gone. A gift is a gift. But Claire's lawyer had found something. 2 months earlier, Marcus had refinanced the mortgage without telling Claire. He'd pulled $60,000 in equity from the house and moved it through his business account. It wasn't technically illegal because both their names were on the title and he had signing authority. But it wasn't disclosed, and it wasn't agreed upon, and her lawyer believed it could be characterized as financial misconduct within the marriage preparation. Claire looked at me across the table. "If I confront him now," she said, "he knows we know. He moves things around. The money disappears. We get nothing." She picked up her coffee. "But if we wait a little longer," she said, "we can do this right." I want to say I immediately became calm and strategic, that I matched my daughter's composure and said something wise. What I actually said was that I needed to use her bathroom, and I stood there for a while gripping the sink and looking at myself in the mirror. I was 63 years old. I had been married for 35 years. My wife had known this man for 4 years. That was almost 12% of my marriage. I kept doing the math in stupid ways. It didn't help. I splashed cold water on my face and went back to the table. "Tell me what you need from me," I said. Claire had a legal pad on the table. She'd already written a list. The following 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I continued to live in the house with Susan. I know how that sounds. We barely spoke, which was not new. We had been growing quieter with each other for years, the slow erosion of a marriage that had lasted past its actual end, but hadn't been told yet. She didn't know that I knew. She watched me the way you watch someone you're mildly guilty about, with extra pleasantness. She made my favorite soup once, tortilla at Christmas, 2 months early. I thanked her and ate 2 bowls and thought about the private investigator's file. Meanwhile, Claire was doing the work. She and her lawyer filed documents with the Alberta court regarding the undisclosed refinancing. A legal hold was placed on any further transfers from the property. This meant Marcus couldn't move the money again, couldn't liquidate, couldn't protect himself through the channels he'd been using. The clock was effectively stopped. Then came the question of my $40,000. Here is where it got interesting, and where I discovered that my daughter, who color codes her calendar, had been planning even further ahead than I'd realized. 6 years ago, when we'd made the gift, Susan and I had written a letter to accompany it. Just a personal note, not a legal document, saying the money was intended to support Claire's home. Claire had kept that letter. Her lawyer argued that since the gift was specifically designated for Claire's benefit and documented in writing, and since Marcus had used the refinancing proceeds in ways that were solely for his business interests, there was a pathway to characterize a portion of that $40,000 as having been obtained under false pretenses, because Marcus had known at the time of the purchase that he intended to use the equity in ways that were never disclosed. It was a fine legal thread, but Claire's lawyer seemed to think it would hold. The confrontation, I don't know what else to call it, happened on a Saturday morning in October. Claire had arranged for both of us to be at her house. She'd told Marcus she wanted to talk about the wedding timeline. She'd told Susan she needed help with some decisions about the reception. Separately, same time. I drove there alone. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes in her driveway before going in. When I walked through the door, Marcus was already there, standing by the kitchen island with a coffee, looking at his phone. He glanced up and gave me that half-second handshake. He said something like, "Good morning, Edward. Big wedding planning session, eh?" and laughed at his own joke. Susan arrived 2 minutes later. She came through the door and saw me, and I watched something cross her face, a flicker. Just a flicker, before she arranged her expression back into pleasantness. Claire was at the kitchen table. She had her legal pad. She had her folder. She said, "Sit down, please." Nobody said it wasn't serious. We all sat down. What followed was the most organized conversation I have ever witnessed. My daughter went through it methodically. The timeline, the evidence, the financial documentation, the refinancing, the legal hold. She wasn't loud. She wasn't shaking. She was the most terrifying person in the room. Marcus tried several times to speak. Claire would say simply, "I'm not finished," and continue. Susan didn't say a word. She sat across from me and looked at the table, and I watched her become very still, the way water becomes still when the temperature drops below a certain point. When Claire finished, she looked at Marcus and said, "The engagement is over. My lawyer will be in touch about the house." Then she looked at my wife. "I think," she said, "you and Dad need to talk." Susan and I did talk. Not that day she drove back to our house, and I didn't follow her until evening, and by then she'd gone to bed with the door closed. But over the following weeks, we had the long, tired conversations that 35 years of marriage eventually produces when it ends. Not screaming, not dramatic, just the sound of two people cataloging what had been real and what had been accommodation, and finally being honest about which was which. She moved out in December. She's renting an apartment in St. Albert now. We speak occasionally, with a distance that is neither hostile nor warm. The divorce is being handled by a mediator, because neither of us had the energy for a fight, and because, practically speaking, there wasn't that much left to fight over. Marcus contested the legal proceedings for about 6 weeks. Then his own lawyer apparently told him what the realistic outcome was, and he settled. The house was sold. Claire received her half of the equity, plus an amount that accounted for the undisclosed refinancing. The $40,000 was not fully recovered. These things rarely are. But a portion came back through the settlement, and the rest, Claire said, she considered the price of the education. I thought about that for a long time. The price of the education. I want to be clear about what the hardest part was, because I think people expect the answer to be the betrayal, the marriage. The image of the two of them in that kitchen. And yes, that was painful, in ways I'm still sorting out. You don't just stop loving someone because they've shown you something you can't accept. The love doesn't vanish overnight. It gets heavy and complicated, and it sits in you like something you need to slowly carry out of a room. But the hardest part was not that. The hardest part was sitting across from my daughter at her kitchen table on that first morning, looking at her red eyes and understanding that she had been carrying all of this alone for 6 weeks because she didn't trust that I wouldn't react in a way that would cost us everything. She was right not to trust that. If she'd called me the night she found out, I don't know what I would have done. Nothing good, probably. I would have driven to that house and done something I couldn't take back. Instead, she sat in a hotel with her coat on and thought it through, and she made a plan, and she waited for the right moment, and she protected both of us. She is 31 years old. She protected me. There's a line I read somewhere years ago that I've thought about often since all this happened. Something about dignity. That it doesn't come from what others do to you. It comes from what you choose to do after. I'm not sure I entirely agree. Some days I still feel the weight of what was done, the quiet humiliation of it, the way the last year replays sometimes, all the small moments that look different in hindsight. A dinner where Susan was on her phone more than usual, a weekend when Marcus canceled plans at the last minute, a feeling I had and dismissed twice that something was off. But then I think about my daughter at that table with her legal pad and her folder and her steady voice, and I think that I did something right somewhere. I don't know exactly what or when, but the person who could handle that morning the way she handled it, calm, prepared, clear, that doesn't come from nothing. We went for dinner last month, just the two of us, at a little place near her new apartment. She's renting now, while things settle, in a neighborhood near the river in Edmonton. She's doing well, better than well. There's a lightness to her I hadn't seen in a while. She ordered the salmon. She showed me photos from a trip she was planning with a friend to the East Coast in the spring. Nova Scotia, she said. She'd made a spreadsheet for the itinerary. Of course she had. I paid the bill. We walked out to the parking lot in the November cold, the kind of cold that feels like a wall when it hits you, and she hugged me at my truck. "You okay, Dad?" she said. I thought about the question. "Getting there," I said. She nodded. Me too. I drove home. The roads were clear. The city lights reflected off the first thin snow of the season, the way they do every year, and for the first time in a long time, the drive home felt like it was going somewhere. I've been thinking about something Claire said almost in passing at that dinner last month. She said the $40,000 we didn't fully recover was the price of the education. I've turned that phrase over many times since. It's a hard way to look at money you worked for. But the more I sit with it, the more I think she was right, and not just about the money. There's a version of this story where I drove back to that house the night I found them, where I knocked on the door and said things I couldn't unsay, and Marcus had time to move the money, and Susan had time to lawyer up before I'd even thought about what I needed. And Claire lost the house she'd worked for, and I lost whatever dignity I had left. That version was available to me. I almost took it. What stopped me wasn't wisdom, it was exhaustion. I sat in that driveway for 45 minutes, and I simply ran out of the energy that rage requires. And somehow that was enough to get me to morning. And morning was enough to get me to Claire's table. And Claire's table was where I finally understood that how you respond to a bad thing matters more than the bad thing itself. I'm not saying that lightly. The betrayal was real. The loss was real. 35 years is not nothing. You don't just fold that up and put it away because you've decided to be reasonable about it. But I've watched what happens when people let the worst moment of their lives become the whole story. I've seen it in friends, in family, the anger that never finds a target and turns inward instead. The bitterness that outlives the relationship that caused it by 20 years. That was a road I could see clearly, and I chose not to take it. What Claire showed me, and I mean showed me, not told me, is that there's a different kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. She didn't call me the night she found out because she knew herself. She knew her own limits, and she knew mine. And she made a clear-eyed decision about what the situation actually required. That's not coldness. That's something harder to build than anger. It's the kind of thinking that comes from knowing what you value and refusing to let someone else's worst behavior pull you below it. I keep coming back to the image of her at that hotel, coat still on, not crying. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt it, I know she did. But because she had somewhere to put the feeling that wasn't straight into a confrontation she wasn't ready for. She held it. She thought. She planned, and then, weeks later, she sat across from the man who had betrayed her, and she was the calmest person in the room. I'm 63, my daughter is 31. I think she understood something about character that took me most of my life to even approach, that who you are doesn't show up in the easy moments. It shows up in the Tuesday nights when everything has just fallen apart and you have to decide, quietly, what kind of person you're going to be about it. I'm still getting there, but I know which direction I'm walking.